Okay, Eduardo, I believe you are a professor of psychology at Community College in LaGuardia and also at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. But I believe you come from Brazil, and was it
Right.
Sao Paulo where you got your
No,
education?
no, actually, I went to college in Rio, but I'm also,
Right,
let me say that I'm also a professor in the urban education program in the
yeah.
Graduate Center in the, past few years. So no, actually, it's funny when people ask that question, I guess I overcomplicate things, but I was born in the Amazon. That's where my mother's
Right.
from. Yeah, but I grew up in the capital, Brasilia,
Mm,
but I went to college in Rio and I lived there
mm,
until I moved to the U.S. And
mm,
now my family is all in Rio, so
mm,
that's where I go. That's where I spend pretty much, like last year was teaching remote, so
mm,
I got to spend, almost a whole year there. I mean, I came
yeah.
back to the US, but I
I'm
spent a lot of time there.
I'm interested in your origins, Eduardo, because I get the feeling that your teaching and your research your teaching at LaGuardia and your research are really closely connected and very closely connected to your own origins. So
Right.
perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how you came to
Yeah.
be a professor of psychology, having been
Sure.
raised in the Amazon in Brazil. This is unusual.
Yeah.
Tell us
Well,
about how you
it
come.
was because of Vygotsky, you know?
Uh-huh. Vygotsky is very big, I think, in Brazil. Is that right?
Yeah, but I mean, I changed careers because of Vygotsky. So let me explain.
Yeah.
So I went to medical school in Rio. Okay?
Uh-huh.
So I was a medical student, and I was in a public university, and those are well, they used to be the prestigious ones, right? And I
Mm,
didn't have to pay a penny, for tuition.
great.
Um, uh, but I was okay. I really liked the first 2 years when, learning anatomy, physiology, the science part.
Mm,
But it was really like a crisis for me when, I had to, start going to the hospital, working like a doctor. And I was like, I couldn't see myself doing that.
mm,
It was also like, this was like the late 80s, early 90s, and we were just coming out of a military dictatorship. So there was like a time of a lot of hope, right? We were regaining democracy, and I was interested in politics.
mm,
And I could see like the in a hospital, like we're treating people, right, whose illnesses were so clearly related to their
mm,
living and working conditions, right? And we're pretty much just putting band-aids on that, because then, right, they would go back and, right,
mm,
so we're not solving the issue. So uh and I just, like the whole medical approach seemed so like
mm,
narrow and,
mm,
and superficial. And so I tried many different things. I had a scholarship, and I was doing like some working with a professor in neuroimmunology. So we're
yeah.
like cultivating astrocytes, like
Mm,
a type of cell in the brain.
mm,
They had discovered they had like a role in the immune system. I did that for like 2 years. Then I was also interested in psychoanalysis, but almost like it seemed there was like a big gap.
mm,
And then I took this class, which was a required class. It was called Child Neuropsychiatry. But
okay.
to my surprise, it was the professor was a Vygotskian. So I was learning about development, and I was introduced, right, to
Mm,
sociocultural theory of development. And I was so impacted and so, in such a big way, like right from the first class. I remember going down the stairs in the building, and I was like, no, 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 that doesn't make any sense. I'm not going to choose this as a career. This is like,
mm,
this
mm,
is nonsense. I'm not
mm,
going to make a living with this. But
mm,
that was already too late. And the whole program, I mean, it was based in a hospital, and we had like this area. There was also a playground when we saw kids. And um, then I did a residency in child psychiatry for 3 years, and I was the first. I was in the first cohort. Like I basically helped them create that. Like the enthusiasm was me and a colleague. Our enthusiasm was so great, um, and I had this experience from premature like infants, all the way to
mm,
adolescents, right?
mm,
And that was really like, I found myself, right? Like I felt like, wow, I got like critical social theory, right? I was working with people and I could see like how we made such a difference. And one of the projects program was called Demedicalizing School Failure,
Right.
because the kids were referred to us like they had been to pediatricians, neurologists, speech pathologists, you name it, right? Because they didn't know what to do with these kids, and the problems were either like behavioral problems or kids simply couldn't learn, right? Like we had kids who were just falling behind. They couldn't progress, right, in their grades, and some couldn't really read or write. And the problem was seen as a medical problem, which didn't really help, right? And then and we were working, it was mostly like group work, right? And yeah, it was like a whole different framing, right? The issue is development, and right, teaching and learning is the pathway, right? Learning leads development. Like you can make a difference in people's lives, in communities, right? And also push for change, right? In the system, right? I remember like, vividly, this one kid, because we were when we assessed a child referred to us, we had to see them at least 3 times, right? And and then had to write a little report, right? And from observation 1, 2, and 3, and we played with them, and right. And it was like, I remember then was going over my reports with my mentor, Dr. Jairo Vianna. He's still in Brazil. And he looked at me and it's like, wow, isn't it amazing? Like how it's like a, right? And the course of interaction, right? Like it's a completely different person, right? That you're dealing with, right?
You're doing real work. You're doing real work.
Yeah. And it's like, right. So that focus, like it was so, relational, right? And dynamic, right? As opposed to, right, those fixed categorical diagnoses that, I did my internship in general psychiatry. So I got to work also as a, right? I needed money at the end of my college. So I work in psychiatric hospitals. And it was also an interesting time because a law had just been passed in Brazil to deinstitutionalize, right, psychiatric patients, right? So that we were undergoing like, belatedly, but Brazil has changed, like dramatically. I mean, they were threatening to put it to, go back with this right-wing government that we have, but it's been resisted so far. So at that time in Brazil, right? So I got to know, Vygotsky's I guess the mainstream of Vygotsky and then sociocultural theory, right, would really focus on social interactions and the zone of proximal development. And I had heard about activity theory, and I was interested in this notion of cultural tools. And then I came to my sister was living in the US. I had the opportunity to come here. I was searching for PhD programs, and I found a graduate center because I had a friend from Brazil who's studying anthropology there, and I'd never heard about CUNY. And then when I read and I saw Vygotsky, it's like, wow, right? So I went there and interview, and they're like, well, there was a common understanding that I belonged there, and I started working with Joe Glick. Yeah, and I was also was working also as a research assistant with Pamela Reid. I don't know if this is correct, but somebody told me that Pam was the first African-American woman to get a PhD in developmental psychology. But she's not the first, like she had this brilliant career. And like, I guess the focus of her career is to show like how biased developmental psychology is, right? That when you study normal development, you study white middle-class children. And when they look for deviance, then you go for, right? Minoritized children. So I was working with Pam on a project, and this is connected because it was through that I got to work in the group home, right? in a poor, predominantly African American community, right, in the greater New York area. And I also started working with Joe Glick. He was the evaluator of a National Science Foundation funded project called Math in the City. And it was led by a professor at City College, Kathy Fosnote. It was a huge project, and it was about implementing a constructivist curriculum in early math across 16 different schools in Manhattan. But that meant from all the way like downtown in Tribeca with like rich parents, to the Harlem, right?
Yeah.
So, and also, schools with predominantly Latino population. So, but Joe was evaluating the program, not in terms of whether the kids were learning or not. He didn't think that was, for us, right? He was more interested in the school culture and whether, a constructivist curriculum, which so instead of you adopting a textbook, right, a ready-made curriculum, this program was like the teachers would develop their own curriculum. They create their own, problems, which sounded good, but it was difficult for teachers, to do that. They felt lost. But anyway, so it was more like whether the program, right, was congruent or not with the school culture. So I spent a lot of time with my colleague, who's now my colleague at LaGuardia and was also a student of Joe's, Lara Beaty, and we were like looking at the school's environment. So that was, but then I wanted to do what I call my second year research, right? I wanted to focus on whether the kids were learning or not. And Joe was like, well, we're ill-equipped, to deal with that. But anyway, so then Anna Stetsenko comes, into the program. I was already a student there, right? And actually I was in a committee, and when, and we had a lot of candidates. And when Anna came, we were like, okay, it has to be her, like, we were all like, really excited about that. And then I started working with her, and that's what I wanted. I was like interested in looking at, the cultural tools. And when I started working with her, like she gave me Davidov's types of generalization and instruction, to read. And I was like, wow, and then like, that's exactly what I was looking for, and the difference between empirical generalizations and theoretical generalizations, and like the whole idea, beginning with Galperi and then also with Davidov of their work with the early mathematics, like introducing the concept of number through measurement, or the sociocultural practice of measurement, right? And the kids understanding that number is the relative is the result of a measurement relative to the unit used. I just thought that was like so brilliant, so fantastic. And you could read it, and it shed light on the work that I was doing. So I started following some classrooms. In the end, I just focused on only one classroom. So I was going to the classroom throughout it was a fourth grade classroom into fifth grade. So it was like almost a year and a half. I was like doing observations, and there are things that I couldn't explain because this teacher was fantastic, like it was a school in District 2 in Manhattan. So it was a mixed school. So it's near the UN. So you had a lot of like international parents, like, well, now it's changed even more because Manhattan has become so expensive. It's like, it's a place, really like a high income, but you also had like low income housing. They're still there, right? So you get like some mix, but like in terms of social interactions, like, there was not much, like the teacher was, right, very, sensitive. She was a wonderful teacher, right? So, but it was like there was like 3/3 in the class. So there was like a top third that was doing well. It was like this solid third that like their performance was always, right, consistent. There was like the bottom third, kids who would, right, who were just not getting it, right? And there was like, some kids who were inconsistent, right? And I remember like this one boy, and very motivated, right? Great relationship with the teacher. So there was not much else that you could explain what's right. I mean, unless you go with a traditional explanation, like, well, right, there's something, right,
Something wrong in the head.
cognitively missing. That's not the way I wanted to look at it. So I started to look at the at the concepts and the tools that they were using. So I started to look at the curriculum. What the constructivist education became in the end was like the district adopted a textbook, and it was all about, like, for example, one of the sections called number sense, right? They want kids to, right? So you don't teach the algorithm, right? Traditional instruction is bad, right? But what they were doing, like, they were offering kids like a vast menu of options, right? Of strategies to tackle problems, but they were confused because they didn't know when I used this strategy, like using the number line for multiplication or an array. And actually the array model was a little better. Like, for example, you have like, let's say 250 times 34, right? So you break it down in columns with the hundreds, the tens, and then the units. So at least they could like orient themselves, right, in the problem, and they could find their way back. So right. And many of the strategies were very superficial. Then eventually I wrote a paper with Anna for theory and psychology in 2006, right? When we go into into this, and really, like, it's like that. It was very clear to me that, right, that the curriculum was not really fostering a theoretical concepts, and we're not introducing kids in sociocultural practice when they could really understand concepts, right, or merging out of the practices and as a tool of the of practice. I became very enthusiastic about it, like that, and I was doing that in my teaching too, and I thought, like, okay, we can attribute, right, a lot of the lack of motivation and the poor performance of students on that basis, because the curriculum and the pedagogy doesn't open up, right? Doesn't right to the origins of concepts. And I thought, like, well, it could be made useful, it could be made meaningful, right, to the students. So I thought, like, okay, I felt like the Galperi and the Vida, like, and I really like how they extended the zone of proximal development, this idea that learning can lead development, but that is contingent on the quality of the education, right? So this idea of theoretical concepts as efficient cultural tools, like I spent a lot of time, with that. And so I was working in parallel with in a project with Pam Reid, and then she left for Michigan, and she was the evaluator of the program, and then I became the evaluator, and it was a program to help women get the guard of their children back. Like, these were
get custody.
4 women of color who had lost custody of their children because they were being tested for drug use, which I don't think like white, middle class women ever had that problem, right? So this goes back to Reagan and the crack epidemics, like the war on drugs. So there's this whole thing that blacks in this country were, abusing crack. So they really cracked down. It was like a war on black people, really, right? Then that program was part of an umbrella organization, and they also had this group Homes for Boys. And then the director invited me to be the psychologist, for the group home. So that's how I started. And when I got there, so that was my main idea, that the kids were that we could address their problems in school, because their school performance was dismal. And I thought, okay, like, I can change, right, the approach, right? Yeah. So, and they expected me, right, to work as a clinician, right, which also I didn't want to do, because I also agree that their problem was not a mental health issue. And that was like, that took a lot of work, because the staff was not ready for me, for my, my position. They wanted me to fix the kids, right? To help them with their behavioral problems, their emotional disturbances. that's how I was introduced to them. Like Dr. Eduardo is here. He's here to help you with your emotional problems because you guys have a lot. And I was like, oh.
In actual fact, you've got the teachers and the administrators have got to be fixed.
Right, exactly. So I guess I was much younger and I was not so diplomatic. So the manager became very upset with me and started to boycott my work. I would go to work and he would send the kids to the park, but I was not, but I didn't want to give up. I really wanted it. I also, I needed the job, and I was like, I went to the park. One day I came to work. The house was closed, and then I see one of the kids coming, and it's like, well, where's everybody? It's like, well, they're in the park. So I went into the park. So I started like for 2 weeks. I went straight to the park. So I guess he learned that I wasn't going to, to give up. I also, like, his boss was also my boss, so he couldn't really fire me. But what I wanted to do, like, to implement like alternative, like, teaching learning practices, I couldn't do at all because the kids also rejected me. Right? They were like, I don't have a problem. I don't need to speak with a psychologist. This institution has a problem, not me. I'm not crazy. And I was like, I'm with you. I heard them. So I took the same stand. So, right. But that didn't really help me, much in the beginning, because the older ones, they wouldn't even look at me. They would come, from school, because I would come to work in the afternoons, right? They'll, like, not even look at my face. But the younger ones, they didn't have much to lose, I guess. So they, I started building a relationship with them. And then I was like, okay, I was like really in a bind, and I needed to do something. So then I offered to come on Fridays. And it's like, okay, I'm going to do movies on Fridays, right? So that, like, began to alleviate some tension, that the manager wanted to leave early on Friday. So he left the institution with me, and I started, watching movies with the boys. And the first movie we watched,
the cat's away, the mice will play.
Right, exactly. And we watched, like, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And the boys, they wanted to bring down the institution. And I was like, oh my God, maybe that was. But then I changed my schedule, and I started working on weekends. I started to bring the kids to to Manhattan, and I joked that they were so bored, right? That became like a tool for my work. Right? Then I could bring, like, 2 or 3 of them to the city, and they liked that, right? Better than being, right, in the group home and having not much to do other than play video games. And then, of course, to come, they had to be on good behavior. So, I found a way to be, right, useful in the.
You gave them a motivation.
Right. Yeah. And then I got a grant, and I hired a video professional, as I asked the kids, like, I was like, at the time, Anna was my advisor already, Anna Stetsenko, and she was, and we're like, it's like, Anna, I think we need a collaborative, project. She's like, exactly, exactly. So I asked the kids what they wanted to do. It's like, we're gonna have, like, a website, or they love the idea of the video project. And they, so I hired a professional, and they participated in everything. So they wrote the script, right, the story, they were the actors, they helped direct and move the cameras, and it was the younger ones. And at that time, like, we had, like, unusually young boys in the institution that were like 2 11-year-olds, because usually they only take, from 12 on. And, the older ones were still, like, kind of like, snubbing me a little bit. And then, but then the project got traction, and we did that every Friday, and the house was ours. So we had access to, places that, before the manager would not let me, access. And it was very interesting. So there was, like, a whole new phase, like of the work, like, through play. And that's actually one of the chapters, right, in my dissertation, which, became a little book here.
Yep.
And as I still want to write, like an article about play, because I mean, that, right, in activity theory, there's a whole, like with Elkonin and many, that there's this focus on play as, right, the dominant activity as a, in a period, but then of course we're talking about, right, older children.
Yeah.
And I presented that at the time at the Jean Piaget Society on specifically on that work, right? Like we filmed, and it was interesting because so the focus was like play in later ages, right, as having this function of social critique, but it's actually it's more than that. And it was what was interesting. It was like the content. So the story that they created was like cops and robs. It was called "You Reap What You Sow." So this woman wins the lottery, and she keeps the money in a shoebox in the house. Right? And that was one of the staff, a youth counselor. She played that role, and then one of the boys played the thief, and he comes and takes the money, and the process of the of filming it, right, making that was so collaborative, right? And like really, I could see like ZPT working there, like those kids who didn't want to do things, who didn't want to take responsibility, and all of a sudden they're like, they're in charge, right? They're really a head taller, right? And but the content, right? What they wrote, the scenes, and actually, and when we're filming the scenes, they improvised, right? And there was one of the boys, like the young boys. By the time I guess he was 12 years old, and it was a white kid, right? But from a low income background, he was, and he was playing the white cop, right? And like there's a scene like we're filming outside the house, and he goes like, and like it's this little boy and harassing a suspect was like a 15-year-old African American boy. What are you saying? These horribly racist, sexist, homophobic, like every prejudice you can think, right? It was coming out of his mouth, right? And they were, so it's really like they're showing like how they see, right? Adult society, like how, right, they see like, right, society as morally corrupt, right? And and then there was like a scene that we're filming inside the van, right? And they were just carrying on, right? And then there was like a moment where the older boy is like, he's like, okay, that's too much, like we've come like too far, right? And it's like and I wrote a paper about on play, like it talks about that, like when children are trying out like their positionings in play, right? And I was like, I really could, I could see that, right? That they were, it's almost like they were
experimenting.
They were experimenting, right? Like how far, like where do we get with this, like with a racist, right? Right, sexist, like like all that toxic masculinity, right? That they were, right? So experimenting. What do they, right? How far they can go, or where they would get with that, or what are the right? And and because we're not censoring, so they could like do whatever they wanted. So, but after that, right, then my position in the institution had changed, completely with the boys and with the staff, right? And then I started to I really could then start focusing on bona fide like learning, activities, because like I was embedding learning in play, but now I could be really, right, like learning as an explicit activity. And so with the older boys, like almost like had a kind of almost like a book club. Like I would go, like hanging out with them in the, in their rooms and talking, after school. And that's when we read Pedagogy of the Oppressed,
Wow.
we read like, Eric Fromm, we're reading other things. And then I started to prepare some workshops with particular themes, so that I could really, it's like, okay, now I can try my systemic theoretical kind of instruction here, but adding like a critical component with it. So one of the workshops was on, I had a friend from Brazil who volunteered to teach them, graphic design. So we began with the history of graphic design, like the first poster, like the guy, like the white man with the top hat saying like, "I want you in the army," right? And then we were like looking at like advertising as a tool, right? In capitalist societies, and then they started to see, like, we watched a documentary called The Merchants of Cool, like how they target adolescents, right, to sell them stuff, so they could really see like, well, that their desire for sneakers was not just their individual desires. That's like a, right, there's a whole system behind that. And I could do also in mathematics. Right? I remember like I had this workshop with that following like Davidov, right, this like teaching multiplication, because some of the kids, they really struggled in school with some of the concepts, because everything was really mechanical. Like it was like unbelievably mechanical, the kind of homework that they would get, right? So I had this workshop like to show like how multiplication involves a changing unit, right? So we had like we were sitting at a table, and I got those Post-it notes, like a little ones, right? And we had to measure them, right, with the Post-its, right? But I also had like like an A4, right, piece of paper, and which was there. Then it was very tedious, and then with some prompting, right? They were like, oh, okay, yes, I guess we can, right? We can measure the table with this A4 paper, and then we can measure how many Post-its go in this. So then you do the
multiplication.
Right? Yeah, the multiplication. And they were like, and I remember one of the boys was like, Eduardo, that's not how they teach us in school, okay? You're trying to make them understand, like working with formulas, right? Trying to understand the formula of a triangle that's derived from the square and the rectangle. It's like, look, that's not how we're taught in schools. And I was focusing a lot on science. There was like a social worker that was hired, and it was interesting because like we had this problem because we had no idea, right? We had no way to know how the kids were doing in school. And then it's like, there's a project due tomorrow, right? There's a test coming, and we were completely like in the dark. We would just get like, and kids were suspended, constantly, right? Which was horrible for the manager. Hated it, because then like the kid would be home for many days, right? That created more problems. But at that time, things had changed so much that we created like a little like this little tool that like a grid with for each marking period, where the teacher would just say, might make comments whether the kid was present or not, and whatever issues upcoming in work, right? And then we were like, oh my God, they're going to hate this, right? This is not going to work, And the first day we implemented it, with one exception, everybody brought it, back, right? That daily report, that's what we called it, and we never had a problem with that, right? It's like, wow, it's so interesting, right? Like a year before, some months before, like right, it would be seen as like another attempt at controlling them, right? Because that's how, the first day, that's how I analyzed it. There was like, they were locked up in this vicious circle of control through punishment and rebelliousness, right? So they tried to restrict their agency. The more they felt the agency restricted, the more they rebelled, right? So really, and I remember like at the time, Anna and I were like, yeah, like resistance is their leading activity, right? And then we're trying to, right, like move beyond that, right? So they really, they like this they appreciated the support that we were offering them. And I started to have like these like critical dialogues with them when they would complain about the institution. Like, this place sucks, you know, the staff, you know, there's always, you know, and you know, but I also like, well, but fine, we are part of it too, right? What we do also, you know, matters, because they also, you know, had fights with one another. They would sometimes steal something, you know, from one another. So then it became also this project of like how to change that institution, right? Beginning with ourselves, right? That we all matter, right? And especially in that small community, like every little, you know, right? Every deed, you know, like created a new context.
Yep.
Right. It was very clear, right? And you know, and I really like Anna writes about that in her book. Like each act changes the whole context, changes everything, you know, which it's hard to, you know, sometimes to grasp, but it was very obvious there, right? So and then then things you know, it was like it took a long time. Like I was working there for more than 4 years, right? And the, you know, the big change happened in the last, you know, year and a half, 2 years, you know. But then it's almost like the change was so quick, you know. It took a lot of a long time, but then like someone we kind of reached a critical mass, then right. And then new residents coming into the institution then already found like a different institution, and it was like yeah. So that's right. But when asked about my origins, you're absolutely right, because the fact that I'm Brazilian, I was kind of like in between being black and white. Right? So I had like had I been white,
a little bit of street cred.
You know, and also that, you know, when I started working there were 2 youth counselors from Africa, and sometimes like the kids would say like horrible things, you know, about them. So there's right, and they told me that one of those counselors said, well, you can make a difference here, right, because of your skin color. They will take you, you know, a little bit more seriously. Although I'm not sure about that, because at the same time, especially in the beginning, when the kids quickly realized that they could do to me what they couldn't do to the staff, right? So they could yell at me, they could curse out at me, and I was not reacting. You know, I mean, I was not in a position to. I guess I could, right? But I never really tried to be in the position to. Right. So it was the staff who could write them down. Like when you do. That's how they were sanctioned. You do something you're not supposed to do. You break you know, some kind of rule. You got written up. Yeah, and then you put on restriction after certain, you know. Except that it was chaotic, and the kids complained about favoritism. It was never clear to them, you know, what you need to do, right, to redeem yourself. And there was a lot of collective punishment. The staff, I think, you know. I think at times they thought I was an idiot. It was like, why is this guy not right? Why is he letting the kids right talk to him, you know, that way, right? And then, but then, you know, started advocating for the kids. Sometimes when they were about to be expelled from the institutions, I would like, you know, be part of like the mediation, and then there were moments when I really. I took a position in solidarity with them, you know, and against the staff. So, you know, and I had to bear, you know, the brunt of that. So then that's how they got convinced. I was really on their side. That they could see me as an, you know, as an ally. So, yeah, it was like.
So you're introducing these kids to Freire, to, you know, Iris Marin Young, and they're reading Eric Fromm. Which is, of course, astounding in itself. But does it go beyond this? Because I've heard the term activist education. Is that right? Activist research.
Yeah. So that right, exactly. So as I was saying before, so it began with in the group home. And at the time, you know, like Anna was developing also her, you know, the theory of the transformative activist stance. So I was, you know, like we work very closely. So and it was actually, it's funny because actually it was Anna who told me to read, Freire, because I guess I went to medical school in Brazil, and in the 80s, now Freire, like on the left, right? He's like lionized. It's like, but he wasn't like that, He was considered passé. He was considered in the late 80s and early 90s, like Freire was considered something dated, right? It was like, oh, this dichotomy, oppressor, oppressed, we're beyond that. Yeah, right. But and then like, yeah, this idea that the focus is not just the kids, their development, but like developing, right, but through taking a stand on the contradictions in the right in social practices, and including historically, and taking a stand on social issues, right, and then really like this, start to call it like critical theoretical pedagogy, when like the critical theories, right, or critical concepts, they function really as tools, right, for how you envision, right, your position, and how you want things to be, right, changed in sociocultural practices. So for example, right, that like at that time, like was the time of the Iraq War, and the kids were against that, right? But so then reading about, right, the history of the U.S. critically, for example, right, like was a tool for them to kind of articulate, right, their position. And then when I left the group home, I got my job at LaGuardia Community College, right? You asked me to explain what that is, right? And so community colleges, as far as I know, they are uniquely American institution, and they were created to democratize access to higher education, right? Which is like a very noble goal, except that kids, the students struggle to graduate, right? Retention and graduation rates are, right, stubbornly poor, right? It takes a very long time for them. It's supposed to be a 2-year college, and they take a long time to graduate, and we lose about like a quarter of students in the first year. They don't come back. So the community colleges, they function on an open admission basis, right? So you're accepted regardless of your scores on the regents, for example, which is like right at the end of high school, like students have to take that test, and according to their score, they get placed, right, in college. And so you can start in college, in a community college, even though you might not qualify, right? And they start taking, now it's called developmental courses. It used to be called remedial courses. So the college that I teach is in Queens, New York, which is I don't think perhaps the most diverse borough in the world, right? So we have students from more than 180 different countries, like 145 languages are spoken, right? But these are and of course then Latino, African Americans, Asian students, but they're mostly working class students, right? Poor and working class. Their income is, I think 60% of something of our students like have an income below $25,000 a year, and so most of them have to work, as they go to college, right? And the issues are not that different than I had in a group home, right? Even though the administration at LaGuardia, the last administration, and it continues, has embraced liberal education, right? So there's like that's the emphasis. So they try to move away from the, like transmission type education, right? The banking, model that right, that Freire, as Freire called it. So the focus is, moving away from lecturing, right, to like all these, buzzwords, connected learning, global learning. This idea that instruction begins with the whole student, right? And that learning has to be meaningful to students. And actually the chapter that I wrote for like the book you added on on projects, right? We talk about that, like how liberal education gives us some opening, but also we critique it, right? That because it doesn't go much farther than that, right? It's really not about looking at contradictions or taking a stance, right? So yes, about activism. So yeah, so as I was reading Anna's theoretical work, then that's how we came to conceptualize the work with the students in a community college. So again, I felt like I needed to have a community, right? Like the work in the group home was really, like the work of a community, right? Where you see like every effort, right, matters. So I invited some students, who had taken my classes to, to get together and talk about, like how their education and the college experiences were going right? So like in relation to what they were learning in their courses, and also in relation to current events, what was going on in the world. Like, so for example, when it first started, there was also when we had like the Occupy Wall Street movement, and there was like also a student movement to stop tuition increases, and also what they wanted to do like with their lives, like their their future aspirations, right? So that's so that's how it started, and the idea was that to create an alternative to to education, right? So the so the activism began in the college itself, right? Like how, right, and drawing on their knowledge, right, of how alienating and oppressive, right, the learning and the and the institutional practices were, right? Because usually they're right. Students are put in a very passive position as recipients of knowledge, or then with the liberal education, like these what they call like white saviors that have come to enlighten them, right? But it was really like this idea that the oppressed know firsthand, and therefore like better, right, where the fault lines are, where the system is oppressing, and then like so this is the so we call this a transformative activist research, right, and relying on critical theories, right, as tools, right, that with which they can position themselves, right, vis-a-vis the contradictions, right, in sociocultural practices, and also how they envision themselves in the future, and what kind of society that they want. And I mean, not too long ago, actually, I learned from reading Chris Gutierrez's paper about that. This is also called the sociological imagination, which I describe in the case of one of the boys in a group home when he was reading Freire, and this was published in a paper I wrote with Anna too, for human development, called Connecting Learning and Development. And it was really interesting. Like he's reading about the banking model. He's like, Eduardo, this is really how schools are, right? Yeah. And then he felt so. It's like it's like I am not the problem, right? I mean, I'm part of the problem, but it doesn't begin with. I'm not the source, right? It's like a whole system, right? That's right. That produces these outcomes, these results, and right, and it needs to be changed, right? And And in Palco was also very similar. Remember, like one of the, so there were actually by now, yeah, there have been like 5 of those students who are now went to grad school, right? Some are studying with Anna, others are in other programs, so they're getting their PhDs. And one of them, I think we described that in that chapter. It's like he also had internalized a deficit, view of himself, like and that's what many think, that they're not cut out for academic work, right? They lack those skills, right? And when he read about when he learned about the zone of proximal development, in my class, and he started to think about his own ability as not fixed, right? And yeah, so that so they, the way they relate to learning and knowledge, right, shifts radically, right? It's not just to acquire all this information, or for to become an erudite or knowledgeable, though that's part of it, that can be part of it too, but really like a tool to kind of locate yourself, right, in present practices, and understanding their contradictions, but also in light of where you want to go.
Is there anything else sort of that you, looking back, you may have omitted that you want to make as like a sort of a final point?
I guess like one thing that I would say is that like my work is really at this interface between like theory and practice, right? Yeah. To a point that like I'm talking, right? We're talking here. It feels like so like natural. It's just part of my life. It's like almost like it's all episodic memory, right? But there's so much theory behind, like right? Everything that I read, that I discussed, and right? And sometimes I even think like even for today, I was like I felt bad. I felt like I should have do some preparation that I needed to prepare.
It went fell. You right. Told us your personal development and your theoretical development together as
and
one
they go
thing.
together, right?
Yeah.
And they go together. I guess like I guess I want to give a shout out to Anna. She's been like the like the most like important person in my my professional life, and I can't say enough like how much like I've learned like not only for her theory, but I feel so blessed that I have this opportunity to work so closely with
support.
Her. And yeah, and
I think it's very rare, Eduardo, to find someone who's been sort of fully trained up in the medical paradigm, not only as a doctor, but as a psychiatrist, to actually have that breakthrough and to move across to the social cultural method. I find that it's very difficult for us to try to penetrate that establishment, get into that way of thinking, and that the fact that you've come from there and drawn the conclusion, it's a very powerful thing, I think.
Yeah, no, and I remember some of my professors in medical school, they were like almost offended that I would leave medicine, to become a psychologist. But what I was going to say is that, so Anna likes to cite Kurt Lewin, saying that there's nothing more practical than a good theory. Yeah. And then she complimented it, saying that there's nothing more theoretical than good practice. Yes. Right. And I think it's really like that's the story of my life, right? Like I really cannot separate, right? Right.
That's right.
And I like to say that because I think that I mean, of course not among us, but there's such a people think the theory, right? There's almost like a prejudice, and I feel like at the college, like there's like an anti-intellectual, right, climate, and it's not surprisingly because we're still very much steeped into like positivist approaches. It's about data and hard evidence and evidence-based practice, right? And and I guess theory really matters if it's a good theory.
If it's a good theory. Yeah.